My name is Kyle White. I recently completed the Master of Public Policy program at Johnson Shoyama, and my focus was on Aboriginal Economic Development Corporations. We looked at specific theories that are prevalent in governance literature around Indigenous economic development, specifically those coming from the Harvard Project, which was a project that looked at the ways economic development was organized on reserves, particularly in the United States and Australia, but have commented on Canadian policy as well. And that called for a separation of politics from business. So we wanted to look at that in the context of Saskatchewan development corporations. So we focus on interviewing different actors within active corporations. We wanted to get a good representation to get different perspectives, it's both from political leaders but also business leaders. And this was helped to be shaped by my committee, which included Ken Coates, several members of the department, as well as a former FSIN chief. And this really, they had some connections that pointed me in good directions for good information. I think we ended up interviewing about 8 to 10 people, but some of those were in group settings. We wanted to be very respectful for any protocols that First Nations may have had in place. So I would always have either my supervisor or a member of my committee contact a person that they knew to facilitate an introduction. Then I would take over and have an exchange with the possible participant and see what it is they needed before we could move forward with setting up a time and a place for an interview. And this may have been giving some background to the project, offering consent forms or confidentiality assurances, but also just discussing myself a little bit. Most people wanted to know my background and the intention of the study. A major advantage of doing interviews is that you can prepare for them. One of the best ways to achieve that would be creating an interview guide well in advance of conducting research. I created my interview guide, I think, 5 months before I interviewed my first participant, and this is done with heavy consultation with my supervisor, members of my committee, as well as some First Nations experts. And this really drew on a lot of the things that we were finding in the literature, especially in the appendices of different studies where people would provide their questionnaires. This gave us a sense of what we should be asking, and more importantly, what wasn't being asked. So that was very useful, and it gave me an opportunity to ensure that the objectives were being covered by the questions, but also that I had prompts. If people started to go off track a little bit, I could bring them back on. One of the major stumbling blocks I encountered very early on was something that I did not anticipate at all, and that's research protocols that some First Nations communities have in place because they've participated in a number of research projects. Some may have been very helpful for First Nations, some not so much. And then the reason that those are in place are to ensure that the research is done appropriately, respectfully, and to really create a sense of inclusion of that First Nation and its leadership in the process. And those protocols basically outline the exact steps for this research, the process that will be undertaken, the outcomes that are expected, and what the benefit will be for the First Nation, whether it's a sense of knowledge mobilization, some, financial impact if you're hosting meetings and catering, or just a sense, or the ability to bring a community together. And then research protocols also often ask about the researcher and require them to outline, their experiences, their background, and what they bring to the table. When working with First Nations and non-First Nations individuals or groups, there are some differences, and the university does have specific policies and procedures when working with First Nations groups. Oftentimes we find that introductions and providing specific context for the research with First Nations groups is highly important, involving leadership at an early stage to ensure that the research project aligns with their goals or desires for their community, because many First Nations communities, especially around the area of University of Saskatchewan, are heavily involved in research endeavors. And oftentimes these can be beneficial, but often they're not beneficial to the community. So it's important to recognize the impact that research has on communities and making that clear, and ensuring that there's some benefit to the communities that are participating. The study certainly shaped, or the research certainly shaped my study, I should say. We had a general idea of what we wanted to focus on, and that was, of course, present in the interview guide, as well as all the materials that we were focusing on and many of the stories we were being told. But the participants that we worked with really helped dive into this topic and provide a much deeper explanation than we could have gotten from the literature. So that was really great. Yeah. In addition to interviews, I contextualized them within document analysis, and this largely involved focusing on many policy papers, academic reports, consultative reports, and government policies, whether that was at the First Nations level or the federal level. I reviewed many policies, policy documents, position papers, news articles, things like that that really helped paint a better picture that was then supplemented by the first-hand experiences of the First Nations participants that I worked with. I've done research for a lot of years, but there's always surprises. I've done many interviews, but of course each interview is very different. And this project was really the first time that I was working in Western Canada, the first time I was really intensely focused on First Nations communities. So understanding the different contexts, structures, and cultural norms, it was a fairly steep learning curve, but it was very rewarding. It was a very good experience, and the supervisor always guides you through these things and tells you what to expect. So surprises tend to be minimal, but they're always there, for sure. Since being at the University of Saskatchewan, I've had an opportunity to work with a number of social economy organizations, including Aboriginal Economic Development Corporations, but also heavily with cooperatives. And the role interviews play in these research methods is highly important. It really allows you to capture a story, and oftentimes in the social economy that's hugely important, because many of the organizations that are strong in the social economy have a fantastic story of how they got where they are. So whether it's a cooperative with FCL being around for going on 100 years, or a new entity in the sharing economy trying to meet a need in an urban center, there's always a great story to uncover, and interviews are a really good way of capturing the perspectives on that.